Every night, the scene repeats itself in millions of homes. After a tiring day, someone opens the kitchen cupboard looking for just a small piece of chocolate, or perhaps a cookie, a soda, an ice cream. The intention seems innocent: to relieve stress, regain energy, or simply feel a brief moment of pleasure. It almost always works, at least for a few minutes. But what few people realize is that this seemingly harmless impulse can be the result of a much deeper process than simple lack of willpower. Inside the brain, a complex network of chemical signals has learned to associate sugar with comfort, reward, and relief. And when this stimulus suddenly disappears, the body is not indifferent. That's why so many people who decide to spend 30 days without consuming sugar report a surprising experience. In the first few days, irritation, anxiety, difficulty concentrating, and an almost irresistible craving for sweets arise. Some believe that the body is detoxifying. Others give up before even completing a week, convinced that something is wrong. But do these reactions really have a scientific basis? And if they are true, what happens next? Does the brain change? Does metabolism function differently? Does taste transform? Does energy increase? Or are many of these stories just exaggerations spread across the internet? Answering these questions requires much more than repeating promises or demonizing an ingredient present in the human diet for centuries. Science shows a much more interesting and much more complex scenario. Not all sugar is the same. Not all people respond in the same way. And abandoning foods rich in added sugars produces effects that depend on the context, the diet as a whole, lifestyle, and even how the brain has built its habits over the years. Throughout this investigation, we will follow what happens inside the body from the first day to the 30th. We will discover why the beginning is usually the most difficult phase, how the brain learns to reduce the constant need for sweets, what really changes in blood glucose, satiety, gut microbiota, and taste perception, in addition to separating what has already been demonstrated by scientific studies from what remains a hypothesis. The 30-day sugar-free journey isn't a miracle story, nor is it a battle between good and bad foods. It's an opportunity to understand how small daily habits can influence brain function, metabolism, and the choices we make unconsciously. And perhaps the greatest discovery isn't what happens when sugar is removed from the diet, but what finally happens when the body stops depending on it to seek pleasure at every moment. For much of human history, finding something sweet was a rare occurrence. Long before supermarkets, shelves overflowing with cookies, and sodas available on every corner, sweetness came almost exclusively from seasonal fruits, some roots, and honey, a difficult-to-obtain and highly valued food. For our ancestors, this preference made perfect sense. Sweetness was a reliable signal of energy. In an environment where food wasn't always available, consuming carbohydrate-rich foods increased the chances of survival. The brain evolved to recognize this taste as something valuable, activating reward circuits that encouraged repeating that behavior whenever possible. Back then, however, there was a fundamental difference compared to today. Sugar was not abundant. It was necessary to walk, gather, hunt, or wait for the right season to obtain naturally sweet foods. Furthermore, these foods came with fiber, water, vitamins, and minerals, which meant that glucose absorption occurred much more gradually. This reality began to change when sugarcane started to be cultivated on a large scale. For centuries, refined sugar was considered a luxury item, reserved for the elites, and even used as a symbol of wealth. In many regions of the world, possessing sugar was a privilege comparable to possessing rare spices. But the Industrial Revolution completely transformed this scenario. With new methods of production, transportation, and refining, sugar ceased to be an exclusive product and became increasingly cheaper. At the same time, the food industry realized something extremely powerful. In addition to sweetening, sugar improved texture, increased the shelf life of products, and made food much more palatable. The result was a silent change in the population's diet. In just a few generations, sugar has gone from being an occasional ingredient to being present from breakfast to evening snacks. Breakfast cereals, flavored yogurts, ready-made sauces, processed breads, beverages, cereal bars, and countless other products have begun to contain increasing amounts of added sugars. The most curious thing is that many people have started consuming sugar without realizing it. It doesn't always appear on the label simply as sugar. Depending on the product, it may appear under names such as glucose syrup, corn syrup, dextrose, maltose, sucrose, invert sugar, fruit juice concentrate, and various other names. Although they have different characteristics, they all contribute to increasing the amount of added sugars in the diet. In parallel, another phenomenon has caught the attention of researchers. In recent decades, the availability of so-called ultra-processed foods has increased significantly. They are formulated to be extremely convenient, highly palatable, and easy to consume in large quantities. The combination of sugar, refined fats, carefully developed flavors, and textures stimulates the brain in a way that natural foods rarely manage to reproduce. This doesn't mean that sugar is, in itself, a poison. Science doesn't support this simplistic view. Our bodies use glucose as an important source of energy, especially for the brain. The problem begins when large amounts of added sugars become part of the daily routine, replacing more nutritious foods and contributing to a persistent caloric surplus. It was precisely this change in dietary patterns that led researchers worldwide to investigate its possible impacts on metabolism, cardiovascular health, the liver, the gut microbiota, and body weight control. At the same time, numerous myths have emerged. Some claim that sugar is as addictive as illicit drugs. Others argue that eliminating it completely would solve virtually all health problems. The reality found by studies is much more balanced. Although there are brain reward mechanisms involved in the consumption of sweet foods, direct comparisons with chemical dependency require caution and are still a matter of debate among specialists. This distinction is important because it completely changes the way we view the next 30 days. When someone decides to drastically reduce their sugar consumption, they're not just removing an ingredient from their diet. They're interrupting a habit built up over years, often reinforced by emotions, routine, advertising, convenience, and the enormous supply of highly palatable foods. That's precisely why the first few days are usually so challenging. The difficulty doesn't always stem from a physiological need for sugar. In many cases, it arises from how the brain has learned to seek comfort, reward, and pleasure at certain times of the day. Understanding this mechanism will be essential to discovering what really happens in the first few weeks without sugar, a phase surrounded by impressive accounts, but which are not always interpreted correctly. The first day usually seems easier than many imagine. There's motivation. The decision is still fresh. The feeling of starting an important change generates enough enthusiasm to ignore that chocolate after lunch or the soda in the late afternoon. But for many people, this confidence begins to disappear between the second and fifth day. Suddenly, something changes. The craving for sweets appears with much greater intensity than before. Small details begin to attract attention. The bakery window display, a co-worker's dessert, the aroma of a freshly baked cake, or even a television advertisement seem to exert an unusual power. Many interpret this as a sign that the body needs sugar. In reality, science points to a much more interesting phenomenon. A large part of this reaction happens in the brain. Whenever we consume very sweet foods, regions linked to the reward system release neurotransmitters, especially dopamine. This chemical compound is not only responsible for the sensation of pleasure, its main function is to teach the brain to repeat behaviors that, throughout evolution, increased our chances of survival. That's why pleasant experiences leave marks. The brain creates associations. If for years after noon, coffee was accompanied by a sweet treat, these two situations begin to go hand in hand. Just smelling coffee is enough for the brain to anticipate the reward and awaken the desire for sugar even before the first cup. This process is known as associative learning. He explains why so many people crave sweets at specific times, after meals, during stressful moments, or even while watching television. In practice, many of these cravings don't arise because the body needs sugar at that moment. They appear because certain environments, emotions, and routines have become automatic triggers. It is precisely when sugar is no longer available that these circuits become more evident. In the first few days, the brain realizes that the expected reward hasn't arrived. This generates a feeling of frustration that can increase irritability, decrease motivation, and make the desire for sweet foods even more intense. But there is another important factor happening at the same time. If the previous diet was rich in sugary drinks, desserts, and ultra-processed products, reducing these foods can rapidly alter the pattern of glucose variation throughout the day. Rapid spikes in blood sugar, followed by sharp drops, often favor episodes of early hunger in some people. When these foods are removed and replaced with more complete meals containing fiber, protein, and healthy fats, the body needs a few days to adapt to a new pattern of energy supply. During this phase, some people report feeling tired. Others describe difficulty concentrating. Mild headaches, mood swings, and a temporary increase in appetite are also common. These symptoms often cause concern, but do they mean the body is eliminating toxins? The answer is no. The idea of a sugar detox is not supported by scientific evidence. The body has highly efficient systems for eliminating substances, mainly through the liver, kidneys, lungs, and intestines. The discomfort felt by some people does not occur because the sugar was being stored as a toxin, but because the brain and metabolism are adjusting to a sudden change in eating habits. Another detail often ignored is the role of sleep. Few nights of poor sleep increase the production of hormones related to hunger, reduce the feeling of satiety, and make foods high in sugar much more attractive. Thus, someone who decides to cut out sweets precisely during a week of intense stress or sleep deprivation may interpret this increased craving as a personal failure, when, in fact, biological factors are influencing their choices. Emotions also play a role in this equation. Many people don't eat sweets simply because they like the taste. They eat them because they've learned throughout their lives to use them as a reward, comfort, or distraction. After a difficult day, a piece of chocolate can represent an emotional break much more than an energy need. When this habit disappears, the brain initially continues searching for the same solution. That's why, in the first few days, some people miss not only the sugar, but also the ritual that accompanied it. Coffee without a biscuit, a movie without caramel popcorn, a celebration without dessert, a break at work without that sweet treat in the drawer. These behaviors reveal that our eating habits are built through repetition much more than through hunger. Fortunately, the brain possesses an extraordinary characteristic: the capacity for adaptation. Neuroscience research shows that the circuits responsible for habits are not permanent. The less a behavior is repeated, the weaker its strength tends to be over time. Similarly, new habits can occupy this space, making healthier choices progressively more natural. This transformation, however, doesn't happen overnight. The first few days represent only the beginning of this process. While the brain gradually reduces its constant expectation of extremely sweet rewards, another silent change begins to occur in different parts of the body. Taste perception may change. The response to glucose may become more efficient in some people, and various metabolic mechanisms begin an adaptation that only becomes evident after a few weeks. It is precisely at this point that the investigation becomes even more interesting. Because when the most difficult phase passes, changes begin to emerge that have already been observed in scientific studies. Some quite consistent, others still surrounded by doubt. Separating this evidence from myths will be the next step in our journey. When someone manages to overcome the initial phase, something curious usually happens. The constant craving for sweets, which seemed impossible to control in the first few days, begins to lose strength. It doesn't disappear completely. There are still special occasions, moments of stress, or emotional triggers. But for many people, the intensity of this desire decreases noticeably. This is one of the changes most frequently reported in studies on reducing the consumption of added sugars. But why? The answer begins in the palate itself. Although it seems immutable, our sense of taste is constantly adapting. Taste buds renew their cells regularly, and the brain adjusts its perception according to what it experiences repeatedly. Imagine someone who adds 3 spoonfuls of sugar to their coffee every day. For years, this level of sweetness comes to be considered normal. If this person gradually reduces the amount of sugar, the coffee initially seems too bitter. However, after a few weeks, an interesting phenomenon occurs. What previously seemed bland becomes sufficient, while extremely sweet drinks may even seem strange. It wasn't the sugar that changed. It was the brain that recalibrated its reference. This effect also appears with fruits. Many people who significantly reduce their consumption of ultra-processed foods report perceiving natural flavors with much greater intensity. A ripe apple, a mango, or a strawberry begins to seem surprisingly sweet, even without any alteration to the fruit itself. This is a clear example of the nervous system's enormous capacity for adaptation. But the changes don't stop at taste. Another aspect that has been extensively studied involves blood glucose levels. Whenever we ingest carbohydrates, they are transformed into glucose, which circulates through the blood and supplies cells with energy. For this glucose to enter the cells, the body releases a hormone called insulin. When the diet consists mainly of foods rich in added sugars and poor in fiber, especially in sedentary and overweight people, frequent exposure to high glycemic loads can contribute over time to a reduction in insulin sensitivity. This doesn't mean that occasionally eating sugar causes this problem. What matters is the dietary pattern maintained over years. Several studies show that replacing sugary drinks and ultra-processed foods with meals richer in vegetables, fruits, legumes, whole grains, and quality proteins can improve blood glucose control in many people, especially those who already have insulin resistance or prediabetes. This improvement tends to be even greater when the dietary change is accompanied by regular physical activity, adequate sleep, and a reduction in excess body weight. It is precisely here that one of the biggest misconceptions on social media arises. Some videos claim that completely eliminating sugar cures metabolic problems in just 30 days. Science does not support this promise. In healthy individuals, many metabolic changes may be subtle. In people with obesity, type 2 diabetes, or metabolic syndrome, the benefits usually depend on a set of lifestyle changes, not just the elimination of sugar. Another organ frequently mentioned when talking about sugar is the liver. There is particular concern about the excessive consumption of sweetened beverages and foods high in added fructose, especially when associated with a high-calorie diet. In some people, this excess can promote the accumulation of fat in the liver over the years, contributing to hepatic steatosis, popularly known as fatty liver disease. Studies show that reducing the consumption of sugary drinks can help reduce this fat, especially when weight loss occurs. But again, there is no magic effect. The benefit depends on the overall context of the diet and energy balance. Meanwhile, another invisible universe is also beginning to respond to the changes. Trillions of microorganisms live in the human gut, forming the gut microbiota. For a long time, it was believed that these bacteria only aided digestion. Today, we know that they participate in various processes related to metabolism, the production of some vitamins, the immune system, and even communication between the gut and the brain. When fiber-rich foods replace some of the ultra-processed sugary foods, some species of beneficial bacteria find a more favorable environment to grow. However, this process does not depend solely on removing sugar. The gut microbiota needs to be nourished with fiber from fruits, vegetables, legumes, beans, oats, seeds, and whole grains. It's not enough to remove them, they need to be replaced. This principle applies to practically all adaptations of the body. Another much discussed topic is inflammation. It's common to find statements that sugar inflames the body. The reality is more complex. There is no evidence that occasional sugar consumption causes a significant inflammatory state in healthy people. However, diets chronically rich in ultra-processed foods, excess calories, and weight gain can promote low-grade inflammation, associated with the development of various metabolic diseases. In this scenario, reducing added sugars is part of an overall improvement in diet quality, not an isolated solution. And what about energy? Interestingly, many people report feeling more energetic after a few weeks. This can occur for different reasons. By replacing sugary snacks with more balanced meals, sudden hunger fluctuations tend to decrease. Adequate protein and fiber intake prolongs satiety. Sleep can improve when consumption of sugary drinks and high-energy foods is reduced at night. With more stable energy levels throughout the day, some people feel less need to constantly resort to sweets to regain energy. But perhaps one of the most important changes is psychological. By realizing they can resist a habit considered almost automatic, many people develop a greater sense of control over their food choices. This strengthening of self-efficacy has been observed in different behavioral change programs. It's not just the metabolism that changes. The relationship with food also begins to transform, and this is perhaps the greatest discovery of all. The benefits observed after a few weeks don't arise because sugar was a hidden enemy. They appear because reducing foods rich in added sugars usually opens up space for a more nutritious diet, richer in fiber, vitamins, minerals, and proteins, in addition to stimulating a more conscious relationship with what we put on our plate. However, even knowing all this science, an inevitable question remains. If the benefits are so clear, why is it still so difficult to reduce sugar consumption in daily life? The answer is not just in biology. It's also in the environment we live in the choices we make almost unconsciously, and in how society has been built to make sweetness a constant presence in our lives. If you go into a supermarket with the mission of avoiding sugar, you'll probably discover something surprising even before you reach the checkout. The challenge isn't just on the chocolate shelf, it's in practically every aisle. Sugar appears where many people least expect it, in salad dressings, processed breads, breakfast cereals, flavored yogurts, cereal bars, sports drinks, ready-made teas, boxed juices, instant soups, ready-made seasonings, and even foods sold with a healthy appearance. This constant presence completely changes how the brain deals with sweetness. Unlike our ancestors, who encountered sugary foods only occasionally, today we live with virtually uninterrupted stimuli. Advertising, colorful packaging, promotions, delivery apps, and the enormous variety of products create an environment where resisting depends on much more than discipline. In behavioral science, there's a well-known principle. The easier a behavior becomes, the more likely it is to be repeated. It has never been easier to consume sugar. Just a few seconds, a click on your cell phone, a stop at the gas station, a vending machine in the office hallway, a 24-hour convenience store. Our environment is designed to reduce any effort required to buy highly palatable foods, and the brain responds exactly as expected. Whenever a reward is available at little cost, the tendency is to take advantage of it. This mechanism doesn't represent a lack of character or absence of self-control. It's part of how our nervous system evolved. But there's another, even more powerful factor: stress. Imagine a person who has spent the entire day solving problems, facing traffic, dealing with tight deadlines, and getting little sleep all week. When they finally get home, their brain isn't just looking for food, it's looking for relief. It's precisely at this moment that foods high in sugar tend to exert enormous power. They don't solve the problem that caused the stress, but they offer an immediate reward, and the brain learns this association quickly. After repeating this pattern dozens or hundreds of times, simply feeling anxious is enough to trigger cravings for sweets almost automatically. This cycle helps explain why many people can maintain a balanced diet during calm periods, but find it extremely difficult during emotionally challenging times. Another important player in this story is sleep. Several studies show that lack of sleep alters hormones related to appetite, such as ghrelin and leptin. In simple terms, hunger tends to increase while the feeling of satiety decreases. Furthermore, the brain begins to value high-calorie foods even more, especially those rich in sugar and fat. It's as if, after a bad night's sleep, the rational part of the brain loses some of its influence, while the reward circuits take on greater prominence. Therefore, many people believe they have a lack of willpower, when, in reality, they are trying to make good decisions in a biologically more vulnerable organism. The same happens with restrictive diets. Those who go hours without eating, skip meals, or follow extremely rigid diets often end the day with intense hunger. In this state, foods high in sugar become even more appealing because they provide quick energy and strongly activate the reward system. This is no coincidence. It's physiology. The greater the deprivation, the greater the tendency to seek food rewards. This is one of the reasons why very radical approaches often fail. When a food is treated as absolutely forbidden, some people start thinking about it even more frequently. The sweet treat ceases to be just a food and becomes an obsession. A small exception is enough to trigger a feeling of failure, followed by the idea that I've already ruined everything. Instead of resuming the plan at the next meal, many end up in a cycle of excess and guilt. Psychology calls this a dichotomous thought pattern, all or nothing. Either the diet is perfect or it's completely lost. But health rarely works that way. One meal doesn't define a lifestyle, just as one day of balanced eating doesn't change the body on its own. What really produces results is the repetition of choices over time. Another little noticed aspect is social influence. We celebrate birthdays with cake. We watch movies with popcorn and soda. We gather with friends to eat desserts. Gifts often include chocolates. From childhood, many learn that sweets symbolize affection, reward, and celebration. This cultural construct makes reducing sugar consumption an emotional challenge as well. In many cases, people feel they are giving up moments of pleasure and togetherness, when, in reality, what needs to change is how these moments are experienced, not necessarily their existence. There is also a phenomenon known as the healthy halo. Some products are advertised as natural, fitness, or whole grain, leading consumers to believe they can be consumed without limits. However, many of them contain significant amounts of added sugars. Reading labels and understanding the ingredient list becomes an important tool for making more conscious choices. The good news is that the environment can also work in our favor. Research on behavioral change shows that small changes in routine can considerably reduce sugar consumption without relying on willpower all the time. Washed invisible fruits on the table, water readily available. Avoid stocking up on large quantities of sweets at home. Plan snacks before going out. Sleep better. Eat complete meals. All of this reduces the need to make dozens of difficult decisions during the day, because ultimately, most food choices are not made after long reflections. They happen on autopilot, and it is precisely this autopilot that needs to be reprogrammed. By understanding how the environment, the brain, sleep, stress, and habits interact, we realize that reducing sugar doesn't just depend on motivation. It depends on creating conditions so that the healthiest choice is also the easiest choice. This is the difference between temporary changes and lasting transformations. And it is precisely this knowledge that will allow us to build practical strategies capable of maintaining results well beyond the first 30 days. After understanding how the brain reacts to sugar, how the metabolism adapts, and why the first few days are usually the most difficult, the most important question of all arises: how to transform this knowledge into a habit that truly lasts. The answer begins with a change of perspective. Many people start a 30-day challenge believing the goal is simply to resist sugar. But behavioral science shows that fighting a habit is often much less efficient than building another in its place. Instead of just thinking about what will be removed from the diet, it's worth asking what will occupy that space. This difference seems small, but it completely changes the strategy. Imagine someone who used to eat a package of filled cookies every afternoon. If they only eliminate this food, they will probably reach the end of the day hungrier and more likely to give up. Now imagine replacing this snack with a combination of unsweetened natural yogurt, fresh fruit, and a handful of nuts. In addition to providing energy, protein, fiber, and healthy fats, this meal prolongs satiety and reduces the need to seek sweets shortly afterward. The body doesn't just miss the sugar, it misses the energy, the volume of the meal, and the feeling of satisfaction. When these factors are met, the process becomes much easier. Another essential point is not allowing hunger to become intense. The longer we go without eating, the greater the attraction tends to be for high-calorie, sugary foods. This doesn't mean everyone needs to eat every few hours. It simply means that long periods of deprivation can make conscious choices difficult, especially for those still building new habits. Breakfast is also worth considering. In many routines, it consists almost exclusively of refined foods and sugary drinks. Hours later, intense hunger, a drop in energy, and cravings for sweets arise. Including protein sources, such as eggs, natural yogurt, or cheese, along with fruits, oatmeal, or whole wheat bread, can help promote greater satiety throughout the morning. Hydration is another frequently overlooked detail. Sometimes, a feeling of tiredness or a non-specific urge to snack is related to insufficient fluid intake. Keeping water readily available throughout the day can reduce this automatic behavior of seeking something sweet whenever a minor discomfort arises. But perhaps the most powerful tool is learning to identify your own triggers. When does the craving for sweets appear? After lunch? During work? At night? In situations of anxiety? While watching television? Answering these questions allows you to act before the impulse occurs. If sweets always accompany afternoon coffee, perhaps it's possible to change the environment for a few days, change the time, take a short walk, or include a piece of fruit at that moment. The goal is not to eliminate pleasure from the routine, but to prevent an automatic behavior from continuing to repeat itself without us realizing it. Sleep quality also deserves attention. Sleeping between 7 and 9 hours a night, when possible, is associated with better appetite regulation and less craving for highly palatable foods. No nutritional strategy works fully if the body remains constantly deprived of rest. Another valuable resource is physical activity. Many people believe that exercise is only for burning calories. However, its effects go far beyond that. Regular exercise improves insulin sensitivity, contributes to mood regulation, reduces stress, and can decrease the craving for immediate food rewards. It's not necessary to start with intense workouts. Walking, cycling, dancing, or any enjoyable activity is an excellent starting point. It's also important to develop a more critical eye for food labels. Products with green packaging, images of fruit, or words like fit, natural, whole grain, or light don't always have low levels of added sugars. Reading the ingredient list and nutritional information helps identify when sugar appears among the first components, indicating that it's present in a larger quantity. However, there's an equally important precaution. Don't turn food into a source of fear. A birthday, a party, or a dessert shared with family doesn't negate weeks of good habits. Healthy eating doesn't depend on perfection. It depends on consistency. This is perhaps one of the greatest lessons of nutritional science. People who maintain results for many years are not usually those who never eat sweets. These are the people who have learned to make sugar consumption an exception, not the rule. They understand that no single food defines health. What really matters is the dietary pattern built up over months and years. Another often ignored aspect is the importance of self-compassion. If at some point you consume more sugar than you would like, it doesn't mean all the progress has been lost. The brain learns through repetition, and a single choice rarely erases dozens of healthy decisions made previously. Starting over at the next meal is usually much more effective than waiting for next Monday, next month, or the next challenge. Finally, it's worth remembering that not everyone needs to follow exactly the same strategy. Athletes, children, pregnant women, the elderly, and people with specific medical conditions have different needs. In cases of diabetes, metabolic diseases, or other clinical conditions, significant dietary changes should be monitored by healthcare professionals. The real goal of these 30 days is not to prove that you can live without sugar forever. It's to discover that your choices can stop being controlled by impulse and start being guided by awareness. When this happens, the challenge ceases to be a temporary experience. It transforms into a new way of seeing food, pleasure, and health itself. And it is precisely this change in perspective that leads us to the conclusion of our investigation. After all, after 30 days without sugar, what is the greatest transformation that truly remains? 30 days seems like a short time when we think about a lifetime of eating habits. Yet, this period is enough to reveal a truth that is often hidden amidst miraculous promises and contradictory information. The greatest effect of reducing sugar consumption is not an instantaneous transformation of the body, but the gradual reconstruction of our relationship with food. Throughout this investigation, we saw that the first few days can be uncomfortable for some people. Anxiety, irritability, and intense cravings for sweets do not mean that the body is detoxifying, but reflect the adaptation of the brain and habits built up over the years. We also discovered that, as the weeks go by, many of these impulses lose intensity. Our palates adapt, naturally sweet foods start to seem more palatable again, and choices that once required enormous effort begin to happen more naturally. Science has also shown something important. There is no single food capable of causing or solving all health problems. Sugar, by itself, is not an absolute villain. The real challenge lies in the frequent and excessive consumption of added sugars, especially when they are part of a diet based on ultra-processed products. When this pattern changes, the body usually responds positively. Blood sugar control can improve, satiety tends to increase, the diet becomes richer in nutrients, and for many people, maintaining more stable energy levels throughout the day becomes a natural consequence. But perhaps the most valuable discovery happened outside the laboratories. It happened in the way we began to see our choices. We realized that the desire to eat sweets doesn't always represent hunger. Often it arises from tiredness, stress, lack of sleep, or simply a habit repeated so many times that it has become automatic. When we understand these mechanisms, we stop fighting against ourselves. We started working in favor of how our own brains functioned, and that makes all the difference. If there are some lessons worth taking from this journey, they are simple. The first is that sustainable changes always outperform radical solutions. The second is that substitution usually works better than simply prohibiting. The third is that quality sleep, physical activity, fiber-rich foods, and balanced meals are much more powerful allies than any promise of quick transformation. The fourth is that consistency is worth more than perfection. An occasional slip-up doesn't define your health. What really matters is the direction of your choices over time. And finally, remember that knowledge only produces results when it is put into practice. Maybe you don't want to completely eliminate sugar from your diet, and that's okay. The most important thing is to understand where it is present, how it influences your habits, and to make conscious choices based on evidence, not fads. If this documentary helped you better understand what really happens to the body when we reduce sugar consumption, share your experience in the comments. Have you ever tried going a few days without sweets? What changed? Your experience can inspire others who are beginning this journey. If you enjoyed this content, please like and subscribe to the channel to follow our upcoming documentaries, always investigating the science behind nutrition, metabolism, and health in a clear, responsible way, based on the best available evidence. And don't miss the next recommended video on the screen. In it, we will investigate another seemingly common habit that may be influencing your energy, metabolism, and health much more than you imagine. Until the next documentary.